Yo, what is up, everybody? Let's go back again. Another story from the collection Out of Words Most Deathly, Short Stories to Chill You, written by Katie Moore 13. Remember to use the links in the description below. Show love to the author, like, comment, and subscribe. Story number 10, Outbreak Drill. The drills had been held for most of Jared Johansson's life. He was 4 or 5 when the first whispers of a new strain of virus, a disease that would turn the infected into mindless husks of rage, who tear the uninfected apart without any prompting at all, went across the world. He was 8 when the rumors were finally confirmed by the medical community and given proper name: blood fever. He was 9 when the first city was quarantined, and life in the rest of the nation began to revolve around blood fever. The fear of it, the fear of infection. So, for 9 years, once every week, at least, and usually more, there would be a drill. There was no set time for these drills. It could happen during school, in the middle of the night, or any time at all. To have one at 3 in the morning wasn't all that uncommon. Jared groaned and blinked, bleary-eyed. The alarms blasted outside, in a roo noise that destroyed the eardrums of anyone in a mile radius. The National Guardsmen stationed close to his building were running up and down the halls, knocking on every door and shouting at the freshly woken residents to get up and get out of their homes. Briefly, Jared wondered if the roads were being blocked off. His parents had planned to drive all night on their way back from their business trip, and an unexpected drill would make them late. Not that he minded. Beside him, Carly stirred. "What's going on?" "Outbreak drill. Come on, gotta go." Over time, everyone just got used to being pulled from their homes, their jobs, their schools, and go through the stringent motions of the drills. It became more of a pain in the ass than anything else after all. The last fever outbreak had been in New Jersey, hundreds of miles away from their city. There hadn't been a single report of an infection anywhere nearby. Jared pulled on a pair of sweatpants and an old stained concert t-shirt that barely fit on his torso. Carly dressed too. She borrowed a pair of his shoes, as she couldn't find her own in the dark. Jared sincerely hoped his parents weren't back in town, or at least not on his side of town, where he could run into them. He'd catch hell for bringing a girl to the apartment. They entered the cramped horde, going into the stairwells. The elevators were blocked, as they would be in a fire. Outside, soldiers created a barrier on either side of the sidewalks like human velvet rope, their guns pointed towards the roads and buildings. On the roads, cars full of people were bumper to bumper, windows up and doors locked, as per regulation. Everyone was being herded in the direction of a windowless, drab brick tower surrounded by a barbed wire fence. The Outbreak Center. This was where anyone within a few miles of the hypothetical infected zone was required to go. Anyone outside the zone, those who were not told to leave their house, were instructed to stay in their homes with the doors bolted and windows shut, and await for their orders. The whole thing reminded Jared of the blitz drills he'd read about during World War II. America was terrified of being bombed by Nazi Germany. Something was wrong, Jared realized. Normally, there was soft, inane chattering among the soldiers, blatantly breaking the rule of silence they enforced on the city's people. But tonight, nothing. They were stiff and somber as tombstones, gun barrels pointed straight out. Carly then whispered, "Guess they finally beat some sense into the military folks." Well, what do you expect? Kids our age who are going into the guard, dropping out of school to join the military, and we're so paranoid about the fever, nobody stops them. We encourage them. There's even talk of a draft now for a mandatory service period. Mandatory service? Makes me glad to have a sports scholarship. If a good college needs me on their team, I have a way out. No way in hell do I want to beat the guard. Carly agreed. The butt end of the guardman's gun prodded her into the side, leaned into him. I hate crowds. Yeah, me too. I hate everything about this stupid process. He scanned the sidewalk ahead for an open space in the crowd, a gap in the line of soldiers. Hey, wanna sneak off? Sneak off? She looked vaguely horrified by the prospect. Jared, you know that's dangerous and against regulations too. You could be arrested. Arrested? What's the worst that could happen? Do you really think we could be arrested? Our brother was. He spent a night in jail for breaking the drill rules. What if this was a real outbreak, huh? You could have put so many lives in danger. Jared laughed at her imitation of a police officer, grabbing her hand as the crowd moved into a tight turn. The turn was the beginning of a narrower bit of path, one that led straight into the outbreak center. It was so narrow, in fact, that the soldiers couldn't line up there, and there was only a fence to separate the crowd from the infected that didn't exist. The fence was metal and topped with cutting wires, but Jared noticed a tear in it only feet from the door. Come on, he whispered, pulling Carly towards the fence. In the jostling, nobody even noticed. Carly groaned softly, but didn't protest. They slipped under the fence, dodging the eyes of the guardsmen who stood on the roof at the building's corners. If any of them noticed, they didn't call attention to it. All the buildings were empty, newspapers and bits of other trash blowing across the street, tumbleweeds in an old western. They walked further and further and further, still away from the center, turning into a residential neighborhood. There were a few people still here, those who didn't have cars to take them into the city, and were just barely too far to walk safely. Jared pulled Carly into the yard of an empty house. He could tell it was empty because the blinds were all open, something that wouldn't be allowed if the family remained. They dropped down to their knees and crawled into the space of the porch. It was dirty, and the smell of earth was heavy and unpleasant, but it was warm, it was quiet, and they were alone, away from the chaos of the drill. The young couple scooted closer to each other, preparing, without a care in the world, to do some sort of things young couples do alone in the dark. Carly giggled. It feels so wrong. Jared shrugged, moving his hand around her waist to the small of her back. Her lips brushed over her cheek to the edge of her mouth, and the world around them was all but forgotten. A creak sounded from the wooden porch above them. Jared stopped. Shit. His lips still pressed to Carly's skin. Looks like we aren't the only ones breaking the rules tonight, she said, pushing him away. Of course, we'd be under the house of the one guy who keeps his blinds open and walks onto his porch during a drill. They snuck away from the house, brushing the dirt off their pants. Jared considered yelling an apology back to the man on the porch, but there didn't seem to be a point. He would either most likely report him, or worse, he would get angry and come at them with a baseball bat or something. Hey Jared, we should go back. Where will we go? If you go back into the city, someone will notice. Let's just stay here. We'll find a different house. They passed the house with the blinds closed. Jared glanced through the window, and there was a pale face of a middle-aged man staring wide-eyed through a tiny gap in the curtains. His hand flew to his mouth. He looked utterly terrified. Carly noticed him too and gave him a confused look. She mouthed, giving a thumbs up, a thumbs down, a shrug, to ask the question in signs. Everything all right? In answer, the man raised, shaking a hand, and pointed down the road, in the direction of the house they had just come from. Jared turned back to see what he was pointing at. There was a figure still standing on the porch, gazing intently over the side to sea under the wooden structure. It stood like that for several seconds, stock still. Then suddenly, it let out a loud, inhumane sound somewhere between a groan and a scream. The figure turned, and Jared's heart leaped into his throat. The figure was a boy who couldn't have been much older than him. The veins in his eyes were violently, garishly scarlet, and his eyes bugged out dramatically from beneath their lids. His lips were cracked apart, with dark ooze dripping slowly from between them, and sores adorned every part of his gray, mottled face, resembling the barnacles that clung on the side of ships. He didn't look alive, barely looked human at all. Carly screamed. A patrolling guardsman appeared from an adjacent street, waving his gun wildly. Get back! Get back! This way! Jared didn't listen. He ran, wildly, in the first direction that occurred to him. Away. More of the infected appeared in the yards of nearby houses. There was no telling where or when it had started, or how quickly the fever might have spread. But they were there. They were there, and they were all howling in mindless rage. The Ragers, that's what they called them, and ran at anything that moved, at each other, at their guardsman, who unloaded his gun at them, at Carly, who was cowering behind them. The bullets did nothing, even as they tore through flesh, opening bloody holes in the limbs and torsos of the infected, clipping ears and fingers. The Ragers just kept running. With his options and his ammo spent, the guardsman motioned for Carly to run. It was too late. The small mob swarmed him, shoving him to the asphalt and trampling him. Carly screamed and screamed and screamed, no avail. Their dirty fingernails dug into her. They kicked and thrashed. Some of them had picked up bricks and shovels from nearby yards and were using them as weapons. They were not people anymore. Not really. They had no souls, no thoughts, no instincts, except kill, kill, kill. Crying hysterically, Jared kept running, praying he could get back to the outbreak center. That the soldiers who were surely coming to evacuate the remaining survivors, close off the area, would find him and save him. That somehow he could escape form. He could hear their footsteps. He could smell the rancid smell of illness that hung around them. They were getting closer. He could tell. Jared's lungs were burning. His legs were slowly down of their own accord. He didn't know how much longer he could run. One of their hands clamped around his shoulder, and he gasped sharply. A long, pitiful cry escaping his throat. The "Aroo, aroo" of the outbreak alarms, the harbingers of the city soon to be quarantined and overrun, was still blaring in the background, drowning out the dying screams of Jared Johansson. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's the end of our story.